I'm James Miller. Welcome to Critical Thinking. In this course, we'll look at the history of philosophy and the development of reason. We'll look at the foundations set by the rationalists and the empiricists, and we'll study the relationship between faith and science. We'll talk about the work of the Holy Spirit and also develop some critical, skeptical tools that will allow us to identify common fallacies. The goal, by the time we're done, is that we would be able to analyze big ideas critically and come up with some of our own. Glad you're with me. Let's get started. A term that's been bandied about a lot in the last 50 years is the word postmodernism. Postmodernism is a philosophical school of thought or trend in the modern era, which derives from a long period of history which has finally been overturned and rejected. In order to define and talk about postmodernism, we have to go back and ask, I know what post means, what's the modernism? Modernism refers to Enlightenment philosophy emerging largely starting with the life of René Descartes, who attempted to shift the emphasis of Western philosophy from church and theology to a question of what can reason establish of its own right. What can reason establish about epistemology, about our knowledge, and then consequently about our ethics and politics and everything else. If reason becomes the grounding for thinking and for the governing of society without the intrusion of the church and theology, what can we construct? And that's called modernism. It's not tied to the current day because modernism is now seen to be sort of a receding move of the past, but it gained the term modernism as a contrast to the ancient world of philosophy and the medieval world. So modernism was the period roughly from the 17th century to the 20th century. Now, postmodernism is seen to be the era that comes after that. The term postmodernity or postmodernism first got used, I think, in the 1960s and 70s, but it describes a period going back maybe to the 1850s and going forward to the 1950s. And it is a period of deconstruction of what modernism attempted to build. Modernism attempted to establish the fact that reason alone could provide for us good society, that we could get human beings using principles of reason to all agree with each other, establish unity and later utopia, so that we could have a society in which everyone simply kowtows to the dictates of reason. Well, a few things happened that sort of brought modernism crumbling down. In 1848, Karl Marx published the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto was largely a response to the Industrial Revolution, in which people moved away from farms and towards cities, and away from individualized labor and into factories. And in the movement towards factories, the factory owners found that they could get a greater profit if they exploited their workers, if they taxed and underpaid children and women, and if they didn't care for the living conditions of their employees. Capitalism boomed, railroads and steamships carried goods everywhere, but the factories became a bastion of abuse of laborers. So Karl Marx in 1848 published the Communist Manifesto, saying the workers of the world should unite. They should stand up for their dignity against the oppression of capitalism. So 1848 began to challenge the movement towards the progress of industrialized civilization at the cost of the dignity of individuals within that society. That was in 1848. In 1859, Charles Darwin published The Origin of the Species. This served as a challenge to modernist optimism in a different light. Origin of the Species suggested that humanity had derived from chimpanzees or monkeys, and through a long period of process originally began with a single-celled organism that evolved and evolved and evolved over time until it became human beings. We were no longer the precious center of creation. We were actually a very late arrival at a very long process. And it was actually a process of mutation and blind chance that decided what we as a species are today. An organism would mutate and create a new organism, and then the environment would weed out disadvantageous mutations, and the mutations best suited to survive in the environment would survive and multiply. And because they would multiply, they would pass on to the next generation those mutations. And it wasn't until the 1920s that Gregor Mendel's work on genetics would give us the underpinning of how that passed on from generation to generation. But Darwin captured a conversation of the day about progress and evolution and said that we've actually been progressing from single-celled organisms to this very complex thing that we are today because of evolution and blind chance, not because of any divine mind behind it, not because of a designer. So suddenly, the Western universities and then consequently the Western secondary schools were filled with talk about new ways of looking at the world and our existence. And it decentralized Western rationality and Western theology. All of a sudden, the underpinnings of Western society were now in question. So Marx challenged the capitalist so-called progress, and Darwin challenged the theological anthropology that made humanity a special creation and not just an accident. Not long after that, in 1887, Friedrich Nietzsche, a German philosopher, would publish a book called The Genealogy of Morals. Nietzsche was a prolific nihilist philosopher. He believed ultimately that life was generally meaningless and that the only meaning that it had was to be made through achievement. A genius expressing himself through art was the pinnacle of society. And if the greats of the greats needed to express themselves at the cost of weaker human beings, then so be it, because the expression of genius is the greatest possible thing. All life, he said, was motivated by a will to power, this drive to take power, to conquer, and to be the best, and that's simply the way it is. And as a consequence, we needed to go back and reevaluate the Judeo-Christian morality that had governed Western society for 2,000 years. He predicted the collapse of that morality and of that society. Nietzsche would say that every term, every word out there has a genealogy and can be traced back to an origin which is not supernatural, which is not divine. So when I say words like good and evil, you can trace those back in history to a point where they were invented to help empower the person who is using those words. And in the same way, all of our words have an origin somewhere in human history in which someone was trying to take power over someone else. None of them originate because a divine source in heaven provided categories for us that were inherently moral. Morality is a creation of the species. Well, now we're decentralizing a lot of Western society in even more profound ways because the literal values of good and evil are up for grabs. They were only creations, and maybe the things that we think are good are not so good. And maybe the things that we think are evil are not so evil, or at least are evil for different reasons than because God says so. So that was these books now are coming out in quick succession. That's 1848 to 1887. These are hitting the public and the universities first and then disseminating through the public. These are filling Western society with questions that it has not asked before and doubts about the authority that it assumed it had after after the Enlightenment, after the modernist development. Not long after that, in 1916, Sigmund Freud published Psychoanalysis. And Freud would decentralize humanity even in its own experience, even in our own experience of being who we are. Freud would say that the personality that we experience, or the ego, has a superego, a morality that imposes on it, and an id beneath it. We have impulses and desires that we don't control and are not even necessarily aware of that govern our daily behavior. We're motivated by selfishness and wounds from childhood and sexual desires and all kinds of things that we're not thinking through rationally and consciously, but nonetheless that are having a huge influence on the decisions that we make. So in about 50 years, these writers wrote books which undermined this rationalist modernist movement towards a perfect society that was built on human reason, and everybody sooner or later would figure out how to do what's right and be productive. And you have Marx going, actually, we're terrible when we're at our best, and Nietzsche saying there's no values beneath all of this anyway, and Darwin saying we're actually just an accident of history, we're not special, and Freud saying, in fact, what we are on the inside is just a mess anyway. We're not special, we're not even in control of ourselves. So those are kind of the harbingers of postmodernity. Those are the foundations of postmodernity. When we talk about postmodernism, it came from that. So even if the term is being used as late as the 1960s, there's this welling up of cynicism and skepticism about the capacity of human beings to determine what's right and to develop a just society. Whew. As we roll into the 20th century then, politics carry out and confirm what philosophers have been saying. Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, and countries began to adopt communism, and that led to international conflicts. On top of that, the European nations, which had always been tribes at war with each other, in the birth of World War I, finally got out all of their aggressions at each other, and we literally had a coming to blows internationally in a way that threatened world peace like we had never known before. Thinking that that was done, it would only be 2-3 decades later, in the 1940s, that it would happen again and we would have a second world war. Not only that, but we know that the scientists and philosophers in Germany certainly were reading Friedrich Nietzsche, one of their own philosophers. Certainly were reading about the will to power and the need for genius to express itself. And we know that the Nazi scientists were reading Darwin and concluding that humanity was a product of this evolutionary process that's not so special. It's not guided by God. And so the Nazi concentration camps carried out horrors that devalued humanity because they had no philosophical grounding to contradict that. In a Judeo-Christian society, the abuse of an individual is fundamentally contradictory to the teachings of Jesus. There's just no way around that hypocrisy. But in a society that has rejected God and rejected ethics and rejected the centrality of humanity, there's no philosophical underpinning to say you can't treat people poorly. Even on a utilitarian construct, maximizing the benefits of the largest group and at the cost of the minority is still justifiable philosophically. So we end up in the beginning of the 20th century with horrific world wars racking world peace and bringing a lot of the modernist optimism to an end. As one of the mid-20th century theologians, I believe it was Emil Brunner, said that the world wars dropped an H-bomb on the theologians' playground. It dropped a bomb on the optimism of theologians who thought humanity would just improve itself through science and technology, and certainly on the philosophers who had no commitment to God anyway. So the philosophy in the Western world after World War II was very cynical and negative. If Nietzsche was already cynical and negative, it only became more popular to be bleak. So you have the French existentialists like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus writing novels that portrayed humanity as a waste. Sartre wrote a play called No Exit, in which three people just sort of torture each other over and over again, and they suddenly realize that they're in hell, and one of them makes the great exclamation, "Hell is other people." And that's sort of his cynical read on humanity. Albert Camus looked at the emptiness of humanity and wrote about the meaninglessness of trying to believe in God, even when we want to believe in God. And he would say the theological case is lost, and the best a person can do is try to live as though there were a God. Live as though there is a value to being a saint, to caring about humanity, when in fact it's all for naught. Sartre would say, life is a bubble afloat on the sea of nothingness. It's all meaningless. It's all going nowhere. And so 20th century philosophy largely went that way among those who would contemplate the state of human existence. Philosophy, in a more technical sense, began to explore language, and that would lead to a different school of thought. But those who thought about the big questions about life ended up very cynical and very bleak. And that period is called the postmodern period, that period of questioning the capacity of reason and authority and the success of civilization to provide a better world. In the modern day, that's manifested itself in an analysis of how races have used science and power and money to oppress other races, which certainly is the case. That has absolutely happened, and it's happened across the globe. In the United States, people like to point towards white oppressors and slavery that existed for over 200 years in America, the horrors of slavery. But you look around the globe and slavery is worldwide, and the oppression of minority groups by majority groups is worldwide, and it happens in every continent. And so we as a species have been terrible to each other. And when one species can claim to have the authority of reason, that species will abuse reason for its own purposes. So postmodernity brings into question now first Western society, and then capitalism, and then the power of whichever majority group rules. It'll now question things like human nature, and will suggest that even human nature is a construct, that our very being is something that's made socially, but that is not inherently determined biologically or genetically. The current movement towards transgenderism and the willingness of hospitals to perform surgeries when someone feels like they should be able to change their physical identity to match their emotional identity. That's a deconstructing of human nature, which is a consequence of postmodernism. It's a consequence of the belief that there are no fundamental structures that govern over us, and even reason itself is up for grabs. So ultimately, the individual self wins. The individual self gets to do what he or she wants and create for themselves the world that they want without any obligation to God, morality, even biology. Certainly not to society, even reason. Everything is up for grabs in a postmodern world. So that's a brief introduction to postmodernism. When it comes to teaching or thinking critically in our day, we have to realize that we are teaching in a world, we are thinking in a world that is postmodern, that has fully embraced the postmodern critique. Everyone who asserts anything is in some way motivated by self-benefit or power. And so the job of the learner is to constantly critique and even undermine those in authority or those who claim to know things. So postmodern education, or education in a postmodern world, is a bit ironic and hard to do. In American universities, we've seen multiple times in the last 20 years professors and presidents undermined by student radicals who felt like what the professors taught was biased, and they seek to undermine and oust different professors and presidents. And I've seen presidents fired from their jobs at a university for doing so much as apologizing with the wrong words. And that is an ultimate fruit of postmodernity and skepticism. It's an ultimate fruit of the idea that the world is not trustworthy because everyone is motivated by power. So when we talk about critical thinking, we have to bear in mind skepticism. We live in a world of skepticism. And skepticism as a directed tool is very effective. Skepticism as a worldview is nonsense because we all function with the assumption that some things are true and that some things are dependable and aren't going to change. So skepticism as a worldview is ridiculous, but we tend to use skepticism primarily out of selfish motives to undermine the people that we feel like are not advantageous to us. So all critical thinking should take into account the idea that we now live in a postmodern world. And all teachers should bear in mind that students largely come at their curriculum with a far more cynical worldview than has ever existed in education before.